Tulsi Gabbard has announced that she's running for the Democratic nomination in the 2020 primary. I'm actually really excited about this. I've been a fan of Tulsi Gabbard for a while now. She sponsored and co-sponsored some great progressive legislation, like her bill to legalize marijuana and another bill that she sponsored to stop the U.S. from arming terrorist groups around the world, known as the Stop Arming Terrorists Act. One of her really spectacular moments that won the hearts of progressives was in the 2016 Democratic primary when she was the vice chair of the DNC. She saw all the trickery and the collusion between Debbie Wasserman-Schultz and the high levels establishment figures of the DNC and the Clinton campaign. And she stepped up and she said publicly that this isn't right, and she made it very public, her announcement, and then she stepped down from the DNC, and then she went to help the most progressive, grassroots supported candidate in the race, Bernie Sanders, who was also being cheated, as she mentioned. So that was that gave her huge support among the progressive base that also was rightfully outraged about the trickery and the election fraud going on behalf of the Clinton campaign. That took balls and courage because she burned a lot of bridges with the Democratic Party by calling out their corruption within the establishment. But she did the right thing back then by standing up for Bernie Sanders and progressives who were fucked over, honestly, by the DNC in the primary. Her policy positions, I've listed a few of them earlier. She sponsored the first bill in the House to legalize marijuana. Way more progressive on the issue than almost any lawmaker in the country, especially on the national level. She fights for it aggressively on all fronts. The fact that the drug wars ruined millions of people's lives by locking them up for drug possession and drug distribution, a crime that doesn't hurt anybody, but has ruined the lives of millions of people who've been locked up for it. Some people have actually been killed because of the drug war. So she's aggressive on that front. Legalization would be a massive boost for the economy. You would create hundreds of thousands of jobs by when you legalize marijuana, because you'd have to have grow houses, you'd have to have the dispensaries, you'd have to have people who do the inspections, and all of this creates jobs, and it creates the people are going to be spending money to buy the product. So you create jobs and putting money into the economy, and it would have a huge effect on the economy. And then you could use the tax money from that to fund other programs like universal daycare, free college, or some parts of a single-payer healthcare system. And also legalizing it would reduce crime. So she's aggressively points out all those facts. She's not just one of those people that say, yeah, I'm for it, but doesn't really get into the details of it. No, whenever she talks about it, she will get into why it's a no-brainer to support legalization of marijuana in the United States. Of course, she's for single pay. It's definitely a requirement of progressives in this primary season to be in support of a single-payer healthcare system, and she gets a check mark in that area. I believe she was one of the earliest people to sign on to the Medicare for All bill in the House. She vociferously fights for the idea when she's doing interviews, when she's talking to the press, or anything like that. She's always out front on the issue of single payer. She's for banning private money in politics. Again, another huge priority for progressives, because all the money in politics is the root of all issues that we're facing in the country, and progressives understand that, and a lot of people in the country understand that. That's why we're focusing on getting the private money out of politics, so that we can address the other issues. Tulsi Gabbard, without question, is most consistently anti-war voices in Congress. Where you rank her on that range would definitely be an interesting conversation, because you'd be putting her up against some real heavyweights in that category, like Barbara Lee, who was the only person in the House, I believe, to vote against the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War in 2001 and 2003. So ever since then, she's been consistently anti-war and has pointed out how these wars in the Middle East have caused nothing but more damage and destruction. and you'd also be putting her up against Bernie Sanders in that category, who, like I've just mentioned, I did a video. He invoked the War Powers Act in the Senate for the first time in U.S. history to end U.S. involvement in the genocide that's happening in Yemen. You'd also be putting her up against Ro Khanna, who's great on the issue of anti-interventionism. He sponsored and co-sponsored many bills, especially even with Bernie Sanders, trying to get the U.S. out of Syria, prevent further U.S. involvement in Syria, getting us out of Yemen, ending involvement in Yemen. I'm sure he's introduced legislation on Iraq and Afghanistan too, but he's definitely for ending all of these illegal, unauthorized U.S. military interventions that are going around in the world. So that'd be an interesting conversation, and I hope to actually have that on the show one day. She was one of the very few lawmakers who came out and vocally opposed Trump's illegal, unauthorized bombing of the Syrian government back in 2017 and again in 2018. If you don't remember, both times I believe there were accusations that the Syrian government, by the way, to this day, still have not been proven by any organization or authority that is supposed to be investigating these things. There were accusations that the Syrian government used gas on the Syrian civilians and killed, I believe it was hundreds or dozens of civilians. And again, these claims were not proven, but Trump used that as justification to bomb the Syrian government, which was an unprecedented escalation in this fight, because this whole time we've been in Syria, we were bombing ISIS and related and jihadist targets in the area. That was what we were claiming. But then Trump took it to another level by bombing the Syrian government. The mainstream media unanimously agreed it was a great thing that he illegally bombed another government. Wall-to-wall praise on every mainstream media network, MSNBC, CNN, ABC, definitely on Fox News, CBS, whatever you name it. You had basically every anchor on these networks. I remember Jake Tapper drooling over Trump's decision to bomb Syria. Politicians, Democratic and Republican politicians, were unanimously in agreement that they supported it. That was a very gross time, because that showed the deep rot in the political system in the United States, so that the president just conducted an illegal, unauthorized strike, and unanimous approval, almost unanimous approval among the entire political establishment, media and lawmakers. So that was so sad to see. But again, Tulsi Gabbard, along with a few others, were a dim, faint light in that whole episode that was saying, whoa, what the fuck is going on? First of all, we have no business in Syria to begin with. Secondly, you have no authorization to strike the government of Syria, who's fighting ISIS on the ground in Syria. Secondly, it's just against international law and the U.S. law and the Constitution. Congress is supposed to, at another point, Congress is supposed to vote on matters of war and whether the country goes to war or not, and Congress did not have a vote on that. So it was amazing that Tulsi Gabbard and Bernie Sanders, Ro Khanna, came out and went against the grain on this one and said, no, we should not be praising Trump for illegally bombing the Syrian government. We should be holding hearings and investigations into how this even happened, and honestly, it's an impeachable offense. So she was out front on that issue. Her Stop Arming Terrorists Act is a big thing. It was also related to what was going on in Syria. We were arming jihadist groups that were in Saudi Arabia that were arming groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda on the ground in Syria to do their fighting against the Assad government, the Syrian government. So she introduced a bill and says, you know what, how about this? If the U.S. wants to limit the effectiveness, and the U.S. wants to reduce the threat that ISIS is imposing in the region, how about we just stop arming ISIS and we stop arming Al Qaeda and we stop arming Saudi Arabia, who's arming all these other jihadists? Because there have been multiple reports and investigations by the U.S. government and also by news outlets around the world that most of the weapons that these jihadist groups like Saudi Arabia and Al Qaeda have come from the U.S. government. Almost all of their weapons have come from the United States of America. So I believe this is a rough estimate from the different articles and reports that I've read. Maybe 70 to like 85, and that's being generous. 70 to 85% of their weapons have come from the United States. So she introduced a bill to stop arming terrorists, which would make the United States a more safe place, and would also reduce the threat that these terrorist groups are imposing in the region. Along with Ro Khanna, she's been vocal opposition of the war in Yemen. I believe she also co-sponsored and sponsored some legislation on it. I still think she could be doing more on this front, especially because the Democrats control the House. So, and Bernie Sanders had already got the war powers invoked in the Senate. So all we need is a vote in the House, and it gets to the president's desk whether or not we're going to end the war in Yemen or U.S. involvement in Yemen. So she could be doing more on it. Blue believes that she's behind the scenes trying to work with House leadership to get a vote to end U.S. involvement in Yemen. She's a huge supporter of workers' rights, one of the earliest supporters in Congress for a $15 minimum wage. She's, again, fought vociferously for that. Free college, like I mentioned before. She's great on most policies. I'm sure I've had a few policy disagreements with her. I'm 100% sure I've had some policy disagreements with her in the past. I'll get into that later. I'll do a segment about that. Some negatives. One downside about Tulsi Gabbard, this might be controversial, and I might get a lot of shit from people for saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway because I think it's true. One downside of Tulsi Gabbard is that she's religious. I believe that people should be and are allowed to believe in whatever religion they like, but at the end of the day, they're all made up fairy tale nonsense. So if you believe in it, choose to believe in any of them, they just simply aren't true. I have several problems with religion and government. As I already stated, none of these religions are true. So if you live your life by ancient texts that contradict themselves and have outlandish stories, or just flat out make shit up, or if you worship a God that doesn't exist, that means you're just willing to accept an unusually high level of irrationality when it comes to making big, life-altering decisions. So you're free to disagree with me on this, but that's not a trait that I want in a president. I actually want a president to push back on the over-religiosity in politics in the United States. You have, for example, like the prayer breakfast, that's like mandatory for big-name politicians in this country. You have the House chaplain. You have Christian fundamentalists like Betsy DeVos and Jeff Sessions that keep trying to hijack the U.S. government to implement their unpopular right-wing theocratic agenda. So personally, I want a president of the United States that doesn't believe in any of the mythology, makes decisions based on cold, hard facts and numbers and statistics, and to some extent, intuition and advice, rather than some hocus-pocus religious leader or some message you think you hear from God. There's actually a story about Tulsi Gabbard coming to the defense of Trump, one of Trump's overly religious judicial nominees, and honestly, I'll have to read up on that, and I'll do a story about that later. Like I slightly touched on earlier, I have a requirement for any candidate in the Democratic primary to get my support. You have to have a solid record when it comes to criticizing the Democratic Party out in public as well as in private. She, like I mentioned, she took on the party establishment when it came to what happened with Bernie Sanders in the primary. She consistently proposed legislation that the party leadership does not like and does not agree with, and she aggressively fights for it anyway. Also not afraid to bring up campaign contributions and how they affect votes in the Democratic Party. How do I think she'll do in the primary? I think she'll do better than most of the establishment corporate Democrats in the primary, like Cory Booker, Joe Biden even if you had like an Amy Klobuchar running, or if you had some other lesser known corporate centrist Democrat. I think she's going to outperform many of them. She'll outperform what the mainstream media expects her to do because they think that she's just some nothing, no name recognition progressive politician from Hawaii that nobody knows about. So they'll underwrite her. Speaking of the mainstream media and the establishment, they will smear her and shit on her for her progressive policy positions. They'll misrepresent her constantly. But I think she'll do a good job of staying on message and just keeping the discussion on track on the policies and on the facts that back up her policy positions. Mind you, this is just speculation, but as to where I think she ranks in relation to Elizabeth Warren, it would be interesting to watch. I think she'll actually finish ahead of Elizabeth Warren, mostly because her popularity among the progressive base, and she doesn't have all the strikes against her that Elizabeth Warren does. And I went into great detail when I did that video about her announcing her run in the Democratic primary. Ultimately, I don't think she'll be able to beat Bernie. Of course, Bernie Sanders has better name recognition. He's got more experience fighting for real progressive policies. Unbelievably good ground game that he's set up from the 2016 elections. He has that across the country. Unbelievably good ground game across the country, full of grassroots organizers and volunteers out front, knocking on doors, making phone calls for Bernie Sanders, and even online progressive media outlet and independent media outlets, even his defenders on social media and Twitter and stuff like that. He has more policy achievements than Tulsi Gabbard, and to be fair, he's been in politics way longer than she has. But that's just one thing to note. I also think she knows this, and this is going to be, again, going back into my speculation, I think she might be using the primary as a battleground to really push progressive ideas and get it out in the mainstream, as well as to get her name recognition up by outperforming some of the biggest establishment names in the country, like Joe Biden. So if and when Bernie Sanders were to inevitably pick Tulsi Gabbard to be his VP or in his cabinet, because, again, she won't be running for Congress again, the establishment would already be out of smears and tricks because she just mauled all of them and ripped them to shreds in the primary. So yes, I think this is a good thing. Like I mentioned in the video about Elizabeth Warren, I don't agree with people anointing someone as a nominee before the primary, but at the same time, I'm not going to both sides you, and I'm not going to pretend like everything's equal because Bernie Sanders clearly has an advantage and is coming into this Democratic primary.